All right, to start things off in here, I want to show you one thing that I forgot to start with. And that was in our security. We created logins. Remember, we created Sally and we created George. I'm not gonna go all the way through and create another whole new one, but I did want to show you this. Let's create one for Sammy here. I used the password Sammy too. I did want to show you this. We could do the roles for Sammy if we wanted to. The thing about this is using the GUI. When we go through and we check all these settings, let's make him a server admin, Sammy, right? Once we go through and pick all the things we want, if we hit the script button, it will actually show us the script. And that's important for us to know actually how to use the commands to do this, right? So just like everything else, if we want to create a table, we use create table. If we want to create a login, we create login, okay? And we give it a name. In this case, we called it Sammy with password. And I told you that's what I used for the password. I used Sammy for the password, okay? I must have had the box checked that said he has to change that Sammy has to change password when they log in the first time. A default database is set to master. So you can see all the commands. We're going to make sure that they password expires with policies and all those kinds of things. Okay. Then after we created the login called Sammy, we altered the server role for server admin. Okay, so that's one of those roles we were talking about. Certain roles can do certain things, and we'll go over those again coming up. And we added that user Sammy to that member. Now this didn't actually run yet. Remember, I checked all the boxes and then hit the button so that it would generate the script for us so I could show you the create login command. If I don't run this, it's not going to create Sammy, and I don't need to create another user. I mean, I guess it wouldn't hurt. I'll go ahead. And I probably messed, oh, I had that highlighted. Okay, there we go. I created Sammy now. We refresh over here, we'll probably see there's Sammy. All right, so don't be afraid to use that button to generate the script so you can see how the scripts work and actually know the commands. But as in everything else that we've learned how to create in our database, creating this login, it's another database object, and almost every database object we ever created starts with the create statement, right? Create, and then what are you trying to create? Are you trying to create a view? Are you trying to create a table? Are you trying to create, in this case, a login? All right. So I want to go through now, and let's try logging into our server as Sally, because we've created this login. So what we can do up here is let me disconnect, because I'm connected as M. Geiger. We can see that out here. I'm going to disconnect. So I just right click on it and say disconnect. I'm going to reconnect again to a database engine. I shouldn't go so fast. Okay. The only thing we're using is database engine. All these other things are more advanced courses. We're using the database engine. That's what we've been connecting to every time we connect. Okay. But this time, instead of using Windows authentication, I'm going to log in as Sally, and you can see I've already done this once because her name was already in there. So I'm going to use SQL Server Authentication. And we remember we talked about there's Windows Authentication and SQL Server Authentication, and we created two different logins, and Sally was one we created as just SQL Server login. So I'm going to type her password, which I made Sally. Okay. And I'm going to connect to the server as Sally. And it says the login failed. Okay. And there's a reason it failed. I knew this was going to fail. We can show the details of the message, but it may not mean a whole lot to us if we've never seen it before. Cannot connect to the Express. So we created the login and we said the login would let us connect. So the reason this didn't work was because of something we did a long time ago. So let's go back in. I'm going to go back to Windows Authentication. Now I'm logging in as mgeiger again. I'm going to right click on my database and say Properties. And I'm going to go to Security. If you remember back when we set our system up, the default choice for what kind of authentication do you want to use was Windows Authentication mode. Okay. So if we're using a Windows account, it uses Windows Authentication mode, not a problem. And we set our server up to only allow Windows Authentication mode. But now I went and created a SQL Server user that's not a member of Windows. Okay. And it can be a little bit less secure than using authenticated Windows. You're losing a layer of protection, but you need to turn that on. You don't need, if you're only using a Windows environment, most people will just use Windows Authentication mode. Microsoft wants everybody to use Windows on everything and have one password that you use for authenticating everywhere. So they default to that. If we want to turn on SQL Server Authentication mode, notice we turn them on both, SQL and Windows Authentication. We have to check this button and say OK. Okay. So that was way back when we set up our SQL Server Express on our computers. So we'll turn that authentication on. And it says it won't make the changes till we restart our SQL Server. Now remember, SQL Server Management Studio is not our server. Okay. Our server is running in the background on our computers. Okay. And you can look here, you see the little green arrow on our little server instance here. That means that the server is running. We're connected to it looking at it, but the server is running. We can actually right click and we can stop the server. We can pause the server so nobody could get into it. I'm going to restart the server because it's like turning off the server, turning it back on, and then it will have SQL Server Authentication turned on as well as Windows Authentication. Okay. Are you sure you want to restart the service? Programs that run in the background on a Windows computer are called services. Yes, I want to restart it. And I can do that because I'm the administrator on this computer. Okay. And so are you. I assume the computer you're on, you're the administrator. So now our server has on the correct authentication. So now if we disconnect and reconnect, this time we'll reconnect as Sally. And it lets us in. Okay. Now, remember, we said there were two parts to this authentication. We have to create a login. Okay. That allows us to connect to the server, which we just did. Okay. But look what happens here. When I open up my databases, there's AdventureWorks. Let's go into AdventureWorks. Oh, I can't get in there. The database AdventureWorks is not accessible. Okay. So I've created the login for Sally, which was relatively easy. But I never created a user for Sally in the database itself. Right? So there's two steps to getting somebody connected. Create the login to the server, create the user in the database. So we've created the login for Sally. Now let's create the user. So gotta disconnect and I'm gonna reconnect as myself again. I'm gonna pick Windows Authentication. I'm gonna connect as mgeiger. Okay. I'm gonna go back into my security, but I'm not. Be careful of this. It's a little habit. It's hard to break. Remember, I created the login for Sally, but in my database, AdventureWorks, under security, I didn't create a user for Sally. Sally doesn't exist in here. So she can connect to the server, but even though she's connected to the server, she cannot get into the database. So let's right click here and say new user. We're going to create a SQL Server with a login. SQL Server user, because Sally is a SQL Server user. Her name was Sally. And we have to tie it. Now we could call this, I could call Sally sells seashells by the seashore. I could give her a big long username like that. It doesn't matter. But we're going to connect this user to the login we already gave her. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to type Sally. Check names. There, she was in there. I could also browse and go through and find her here. There's Sally right there. I'm connecting the login we created to this user that we're creating, right? So logins and users are separate, but normally we give them the same name because it saves a lot of confusion, right? So the login name is Sally. We had already created that. Now we're creating the user named Sally that's connected to that login. Okay. All right. We can go through here. We could give her own schemas if we wanted to. We're going to see a little bit more about that in a second because I want to demonstrate this. I know it's a lot of back and forth. We can also hit the script button. We can hit OK here to create the account, or we can look at the script. Let's look at the script for creating a user. Here's the script. Imagine that. When we create a login, it's create login. When we create a table, it's create table. When we create a view, it's create view. When we create a user, it's create user. And we give it a name. Remember, they put the square brackets around everything when they generate these automatically, in case you have a space or something in the name. So I created a user Sally that's connected to for the login Sally. So Sally was the login, and we connected it to this new user we're creating. Create user Sally for login Sally. Okay. I'll go ahead and run this. Actually, I won't. Let's close it down. Let's create it again. Sally, login name, Sally. We're connecting them. Instead of scripting it, I'll just say OK, and we can see that whether we run the script or use the GUI, either way, it creates Sally as a user. All right. So create the login to the server. Create the user in the database that's connected to the login in the server. Okay. I'm going to log out. I'm going to disconnect from the server and reconnect to Sally again. And I'm going to put remember password so I don't have to keep typing it. Okay. Now I'm connected to Sally. Can I get into the database? I sure can. But where's my tables? Right? So I gave Sally permission to get into the database, but I really didn't give her any roles. I didn't give her anything that she can do. Okay. So let's go back out and go back in. So I'm going to disconnect. Reconnect as myself, who has full control of everything. Go back to my database. Now you could obviously have done this all at once. I'm going back and forth to show you that each step of the way gives a little bit more permissiveness to the accounts we create, right? We create the login and they can connect to the server, but they can't get in the database. We create the user in the database and connect it to that login. Now they can get logged into the server with their login, connected to the database as a user, but we didn't give the user permission to really do anything yet. Okay, so go back down here. Let's find Sally. I double click on her. What can she do? Well, she doesn't own any schemas. Let's give her some of this DB data writer and this DB data reader. Let's make it so she can read and write to the database. Sounds like a good idea, right? All right. Sally just got permission to read and write to this database. How do we know? Well, we'll disconnect. Connect again. We're going to connect to Sally this time. Let's go into the database, AdventureWorks. Did I not save that? All right, I'm going to run back in. I think I may have forgotten to save it, maybe. Database, AdventureWorks. Security. There's Sally. Membership. Data reader, data writer. I never said okay. If we want to look at the script, it actually wrote a script, alter role, data reader, add member Sally, alter role, data writer, and we're going to talk about these roles in a little bit. We added Sally to that. So she's a data reader and a data writer. I don't think I ever hit okay. Okay, I ran it just to be sure. Disconnect. Log in as Sally. Go into my AdventureWorks database. Now look, I can see all the tables. I could run commands against those tables because those roles give her permission to read and write data to the tables. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So the idea about creating a user, create the login, then create the user connected to that login, and then you have to give the user permission to do things. And we're going to talk more about permissions and these idea of roles. I think I'll talk about that in the next video before we even talk about the commands that do it. And I'll see you in the next video.